Hello and welcome to the first podcast of the 2022 series from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askary. I'm the vice chairman of the Belt and Road Institute. Today we have a special treat for you as the Olympic Games are ongoing in Beijing, and which are actually a beautiful dialogue among all nations of different cultural, social, political background in a spirit of friendship and clean competition. As you know, or we have explained earlier, that there are 5 principles of the Belt and Road Initiative, which are the political coordination, the financial coordination, unimpeded trade, connectivity, physical connectivity, infrastructure, and people-to-people relations. And people-to-people relations is today's theme for our dialogue with our guest, which I will introduce soon, on the question of the cultural Belt and Road and dialogue of civilization, and at what level that dialogue of civilization should be. Recently, we published a paper which we called "Why It Is Important to Read the Mind of the Chinese Leadership." We reviewed the 6th plenary session of the China of the Communist Party of China, the 6th plenary session of the 19th Central Committee, which issued a very important historical document. But in the introduction of that, our review of that paper, we say, quote, "To be able to forecast where China is heading in the near and farther future, including the fate of the Belt and Road Initiative, we need a deeper and unbiased review of the process of decision-making and the thought process behind it, that is in China. Even if you are a rival of China, you need to know how, why, and where it is moving." So in that sense, the nation which is leading the Belt and Road Initiative and its leadership have a certain method of thinking. They have a certain set of goals, what they want to do with the Belt and Road, but also what they want to do with the future of China. And it's important for anybody who's interested in figuring out that to understand how the Chinese leadership thinks. In the document, which is called the Vision and Actions on Jointly Building Silk Road Economic Belt and 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, issued in 2015 by the National Development and Reform Commission of China. This is a very important basic document to understand the thinking behind the whole Belt and Road Initiative. That was the first paper document, or official document, on the Belt and Road. The paper says the connectivity projects of the initiative will help align and coordinate the development strategies of the countries along the Belt and Road, tap market potential in this region, promote investment and consumption, create demand and job opportunities, enhance people-to-people and cultural exchanges, and mutual learning among the peoples of the relevant countries, and enable them to understand, trust, and respect each other, and live in harmony, peace, and prosperity. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, to discuss this question, we have a distinguished panel, which is Mr. Richard Black. He is the International Schiller Institute's representative at the United Nations. Welcome, Richard. You are muted. And Stephen Brawer, he is now the chairman of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. First, Richard, I think you had discussed a very interesting matter when the Chinese leadership they had a press conference producing the 14th five-year plan in 2020. There was a fascinating surprise for many people, but I guess it was not a surprise for you. The Chinese spokesperson said, "We are no longer going to measure economic progress in GDP numbers. That's not the correct measurement." At the same time, they decided to invest 10% of GDP in cultural production. Can you tell us a bit about the reactions to that announcement and how you perceived it?
Well, it was important to see that this was a long presentation by, I think, the leadership of the international section of the Communist Party of China, and it was maybe an hour and a half presentation on the coming announcement of the 14th five-year plan. And what they said was, what we are going to do is a completely new method of development, a new plan, a new paradigm, the way it has not been done before. And what they outlined is that the engine of economic growth, the engine of prosperity, is going to be increasing the rates of scientific and technological innovation. And then as a part of that, that there is going to be an increasing national expenditure on the arts. That is the building of concert halls, museums, schools, conservatories, and the teaching of art and music as a way of impacting the population. Now, this was a presentation by a group of professional economists steeped in numbers. So the way I described it at the time, this was a surprise embedded within a bombshell. The bombshell was that we are not going to measure the economy by GDP, by numbers. We're going to measure it by a new measure, yet to be determined, of how do we increase the rate of expansion of innovation in the physical economy. Very much reminiscent of the American philosopher and economist Lyndon LaRouche in his concept of relative potential population density, an aspect of physical economy. Then they went on to discuss, and this astounded many in China, that as a horizon, we would expend as much as up to 10% of the output of the economy in the arts. Now, I think that's a horizon rather than a number. So this unsettled many people. There are about 200 people live in the audience. We can go back to some of the incidents of that. But to me, it was not surprising. I had been looking into this matter with the hunch that since President Xi is steering a cultural renaissance, there had to be a way in which China was looking at economic development differently. And of course, in looking at it a bit, the figure that comes to the fore is the current premier, Li Keqiang, who was the leader of the Communist Party in Liaoning province about 15 years ago. And this was a major international story at the time. In brief, he was speaking to an American diplomat, and when various diplomatic cables were leaked, the following story came out, that Li Keqiang, the leader of the province at the time, he said to the American diplomat, "We're not going in my province by GDP. I think those numbers are man-made, meaning made up by the local communists and other officials, to meet, they'll be given a quota and then they meet it. They're given a quota, then they meet it. And it had nothing to do with the success and the prosperity of the province." And he devised a physical economic approach to economic advance by a series of metrics, including things like rates of change of freight moved on the rail system, numbers of new loans initiated, a whole series of predictive tools as to the direction that the economy was going. This story broke out in the international media, and the Wall Street Journal, the London Economist, and the other Anglo-American financial crowd, that is the usury crowd, completely freaked out. And they realized that what Li Keqiang was doing, his forecasting of what was happening in China was far superior to what was coming out of the West. So what they did is they ran to their computers and they started trying to mimic his programs, and they published something they called the Li Keqiang Index. So this whole discussion of GDP is a fossil of a monetarist outlook. typified by the City of London, the University of Chicago, and that there had to be a better way. And at this announcement that Hussein, you're referring to, the number of economists, I think maybe there were 4 economists, discussed this, in which they refused, they actually refused to give any numbers of the plan for the 5-year plan at that session.
You used a term, the Renaissance. China is embarking on a Renaissance. And I think this is what is really the essence. As Westerners, we can understand what China is doing. The Chinese call it the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Now, the Communist Party of China has some stepping stones: 2020, eliminating poverty; 2035, creating a socialist modern society. But in 2049, the goal is very interesting. It says by 2049, China will be building a modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful. That's a long list of achievements. And you mentioned the question of art. I think this idea of, the impact of art on scientific progress, on creativity and innovation. I think the Chinese leadership have understood this very, very deeply, especially President Xi Jinping. There was a dialogue between President Xi Jinping and professors dealing with questions of art and aesthetics. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, well, in 2018, a group of professors at the leading art university sent a letter to President Xi Jinping saying that we're falling behind what's required in terms of teaching aesthetics, all kinds of art, immersing the young population in beauty, and this needed to be changed. Xi Jinping wrote back and said, yes, you're right, this should be changed. So in the course of
one thing is that that people who I visited China a couple of times. I think you also visited China. I watched the Chinese TV, the youth programs, they looked exactly like in the West. Pop stars, YouTubers, fashion stars, all kinds of things. A massive level of actually banality in the Chinese, among the Chinese youth. And I think there is a reaction to that, that copying this culture of banality, in a sense, focusing on the sensuous or, money, getting rich quick. I think that created a certain reaction. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think there was a certain
it was
background.
Yes. So President Xi engaged then in a campaign. In 2019, he gave a major speech to a group of artists, musicians, literary figures, high level, a large grouping, called, I believe, "A Nation Must Have a Soul." I have a quote here, which our viewers will find interesting. President Xi said to these teachers, professors, musicians, he said, "We should build social norms by promoting virtue. According to Zuo's commentary on the spring and autumn annals, the highest attainment is to exemplify virtue. The second highest is to perform great deeds. The third highest is to put forth noble ideas. People working in literary, art, philosophy, and social science circles have the responsibility to inspire minds, to refine character, and to warm hearts. You also shoulder the mission to cultivate morality and consolidate the foundations of our society through your works. As well-known public figures, you are expected to set an example for society with your lofty aspirations, sound morals, and noble sentiments. To promote virtue, we should first establish moral integrity. And that sort of goes Hussein, to what you were saying, to the extent that China, under the brilliant Deng Xiaoping in the 80s, said, well, we're a backward nation. And we are also a nation of great historic culture and science. It's time again to, he said, love China. And we're going to learn from the West, their science, their art. He didn't mean we're going to become a greedy capitalists based upon dog eat dog. He said we become backward and the West has advanced in science and art. And we're going to send our young people all over the globe and they're going to learn the frontiers of science. And in this sense, Xi Jinping is moving the process forward and making a point that art, he said, we are going to run a Confucian Renaissance. It's here. Confucius is the basis of our future. It's the basis of our tradition. It's the basis of our future. And the artists are responsible for immersing the young generation in beauty. Yeah. And to create beautiful minds.
Exactly. That's a very important point. It's like the figure of Confucius, the role of Confucius. And I think President Xi Jinping is very consciously driving China into that direction. But President Xi Jinping, in many of his speeches, already in 2012, 2013, he said, innovation is our Achilles heel. We have not reached the level which will make us, that will be our downfall. Because we can produce as much as we want, cheap stuff, but if we don't innovate. And then he referenced the United States, actually. He said the United States became the world's first power, economic power, because it attracted the best minds of the world, the most creative, innovative minds. The United States became a world power, not by occupying and looting other countries, but by focusing on innovation, scientific progress. And he said that's what is missing in China. This is what we need to build. But the question of innovation, or we call creativity, it depends actually not on a collective effort, although it's very important to have a cultural renaissance, but inside the mind of the individual. As Schiller, the namesake of the institute you are representing, is that this idea of beautiful mind, a beautiful soul, which is capable of discovering things which are hitherto not known, because it all depends also on a certain cultural level, rather than just hard work and training. You don't get new discoveries by hard work on previous things. You need to be playful, as Schiller says, in that sense. So this idea of aesthetical education is, I think, the Chinese leadership, President Xi Jinping personally, have actually put his finger on this question.
Well, it's a great discovery that innovation in physical science and aesthetic education are aspects of the same moral development of the character. And this innovation idea is critical. I can show you as a graph here. You can see this graph. This is from a recent newsletter from the Science and Technology Ministry of China. And it's a graph of something they invented, the Innovation Capacity Index. This goes from 2010 to 2018. It has 18 different parameters, which I won't go through. And it is implemented in 169 high-tech centers in China, involving 120,000 companies. They are serious. They are not kidding around. The idea is that the heart of economic success is rates of discovery. I remember a wonderful speech that the great Lyndon LaRouche once gave on economics. And at a certain point, to make the point, he said, discover, 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 discover. That's the heart of economics. That's the heart of success. And the Chinese have embraced this universal truth, whether it's Leibniz, LaRouche, what the Chinese are doing today. This is a matter of understanding how the universe works. And Schiller, that you mentioned, the namesake of our institute, as some of your viewers may know, after watching the disaster of the hideous bloodshed of the French Revolution, which beforehand many intellectuals around the world had great hopes for, that the American Revolution would be reproduced in Europe, it led to a disaster. And he said, Schiller, after the French Revolution, a great moment has found the little people. They were little morally. And then he wrote his famous aesthetic letters, in which he said, the population has to be lifted up. The moral character, the character of the population has to be transformed. Otherwise, you'll never have political freedom. And there's only one instrument, only one, which can lift up the morals of the population, and that is immersing them in works of great classical beauty, poetry, sculpture, art, painting, etc. And this, in their own Chinese way, the Chinese have adopted as state policy. They're not fooling around.
Yeah, and it's not like a romantic longing to the beautiful past or something. It's a practical, a living thing to rejuvenate the classical culture of China in art, music, poetry, painting, in all aspects. So that's something which is, China will advance by leaps and bounds if they follow that path, and they will leave the rest of humanity behind in the trails. But we don't want that to become like this dichotomy in the world, because even the Chinese say we cannot survive without the rest of the world. We cannot make it neither economically, culturally, or otherwise. And it's interesting that, you work in the United Nations, you talk to diplomats from all over the world, and you have a certain experience in talking to people from different cultures, which is quite enriching experience. But you mentioned the fact that the American Revolution, you are American. It's difficult to miss. Our colleague, Stephen Brawer, is also American, but he has lived here in Europe many years, because there is an aspect of the American history and culture. You mentioned Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, which Stephen will has done some important research. But concerning the founding fathers of the United States, who of them was interested in Chinese culture, and specifically Confucius?
Well, certainly,
Richard, you can start, and Stephen can.
It's well known among people that have looked into this that Dr. Benjamin Franklin studied Confucius and printed translations of Confucius in his journals in Pennsylvania. But the founding fathers as a whole, you see it in the Federalist Papers, were searching for a series of moral and philosophical metrics by which to found a new development paradigm. Even in America, this is not taught, but this was not an economic upheaval. This was not a tax revolt. These men were geniuses. Hamilton, Lafayette, Washington were geniuses. People get discouraged about the difficulty of the current world picture today, the threat of nuclear war over Taiwan, over Ukraine. What were the odds of Benjamin Franklin's plan, once it became clear that that's what it had to be, to defeat the British Empire? What were the odds of that succeeding? You can't come up with a number. The numbers don't work. It was a vision. Franklin was a visionary, and part of what he was searching for, he looked for in Confucius.
Yeah. Stephen, you did some research on this matter, Benjamin Franklin, and you dug up some material which we presented in a couple of our seminars. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, Benjamin Franklin is obviously known as probably the most important founder or thinker of the beginnings of the United States, even if the end of his life was at the point where the Constitution was actually founded. But where these ideas emerge has been unfortunately lost. And the role of, I think, the greatest universal genius, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who, by the way, was by the very final works, or towards the final point of the great thinker Lyndon LaRouche, who Mr. Black referred to, wrote a document in which he wanted to identify the inspiration.
But first, Steve, can you give the listeners who don't know who Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz is something about his life, where he lived, where he worked, what time frame?
Yeah, I will do that. But I wanted to just say that the principle that LaRouche wrote this document towards the very end of his life on 2008 was on monadology. Now, that is one of the most essential documents of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He lived from 1646 until 1716. He was in the middle of, probably in a certain way, the most prolific philosophical, theological period of intense discussion and debate at the highest level. And he represented in his thinking a vision that spread not only eastward, which I will specify in terms of the work he did regarding China, where he actually produced a document called Novissima Sinica, which was in 1697.
What does it mean?
I'm sorry?
What does
That's the new China, or the New East. It was a collection of letters and essays that Leibniz put together based on the work of Jesuit missionaries who were working in China directly on the issue of exchanging the discussions in science and in the works of and the history of Confucius. Now, there is a very important parallel, which I will mention. I can't go into the details, but Leibniz, one of Leibniz's most profound ideas, is based on what he called the pre-established harmony. Now, that is in very much connected to the Chinese concept of harmony in the work of Confucius. There is a direct interface that is relevant, in my view, extremely relevant for how this bridge for reestablishing the links between Western society, which unfortunately in the modern period have been buried or lost in terms of the importance of the active role of Leibnizian thinking. But by reviving that, we have the possibility of also reestablishing the connection and the vision that Richard was elaborating in terms of what the thinking of the Chinese leadership is in a rejuvenation, which obviously the length of Chinese history is extremely longer than even what we know in Western European history. It goes back more than 5,000 years. And in that process, you had this notion of the role of Confucius, but even earlier, what Leibniz develops, which I just will mention, you can't go into it, but the binary system, which is the foundation for modern computer technology, was developed by Leibniz, and it was very much based on some of the studies he was doing in the later part of his life on Chinese culture. So Leibniz's ideas about how to unite and build the, in fact, his direct reference to the role of Russia, which is, and the fact that he established scientific academies in Berlin and in Petersburg. And they were premised on the highest level of scientific academies that he had been active in Paris and even in England. That this was the principle and how to integrate both studies which he led and his networks led in terms of the language projects, where they were actually for the first time in I think known Western history. Leibniz worked out of Leipzig for a great period of time. Then he moved to Hanover, but the city nearby Leipzig, which is called Halle, was the area where the beginnings of the first actual Oriental language studies. The man by the name of Franke, who actually worked directly with Leibniz on the China projects, was involved in how to both study languages and build scientific academies to bridge human civilization as one great project.
What was Leibniz's view of how Europe and China can work together? Because obviously he understood that China represents a different culture, but there are certain common universal ideas.
Yeah, precisely. Well, the debate was between certain Jesuit networks, some of which were trying to operate on the more dogmatic idea that if the Chinese leadership did not convert directly to Christian principles or Christianity directly, then they were heathens, and therefore not to be treated as anything other than that. Now, there was another group that Leibniz was directly working with who resisted that and were actively involved in researching the role in China of principles based on a notion of a universal creative principle. And that universal creative principle, which even came before Confucius, which Leibniz was evaluating with his work in these Jesuit groupings. And there is a lot written on this. I don't have it directly here to present, but the role of these Jesuit groupings that Leibniz worked with had the very clear idea that there was no fundamental problem in collaborating with the Confucius networks, because they had a moral principle and a moral principle of man. And that, to make the point a little bit more clear with what Richard raised with Benjamin Franklin, the network that I mentioned out of Halle, Franke, was directly collaborating with Cotton Mather. And Cotton Mather was the teacher of Benjamin Franklin in the Boston area when Franklin was a very young man at the time of this great discussion around the importance of Eastern and Western collaboration. So there was a direct connection between these Leibnizian networks into both China and the United States. And that's what I think could be the bridge or the foundation for rebuilding that kind of foundation for today.
Yeah, now we are digging very, very deep into history and ideas and philosophy, which is fantastic. I think we should have a whole seminar, a webinar on these matters, because the level we discussed about where China is aiming at in terms of a culture, in terms of philosophical thinking, scientific thinking, is going to be like this here. But we will not be able to have a dialogue with China from here. We will have to rise in our culture, in our scientific progress, in our art and philosophical outlook of man and society, also to a higher level, because it would be quite problematic to have a world which is functioning on different levels. And that brings us, I think, unfortunately, to the conclusion of this very fascinating discussion. Because Richard, you meet with diplomats. I don't know what Chinese diplomats tell you about how far down people do respect. I know from the Arab world, people did respect the United States before World War I, even after World War I and during World War II, but then things started to deteriorate. And the United States became a hated country everywhere in the world. And people think this is unfortunate because there's so much great things that can come out of collaboration between the United States, between Europe and China, and even Russia, than having all these conflicts we see today. What do Chinese diplomats tell you about that problem?
Well, I can tell you that Chinese diplomats, Russian diplomats, African diplomats tell me that they love talking to Americans. They love whenever they have an opportunity, rarely, to speak to real Americans, farmers, taxi drivers, whatever. They love the typical Americans' openness, friendliness, warmth, and optimism. Unfortunately, the current government is a war party and is about to get the world blown up in a thermonuclear annihilation, if not stopped. But diplomats who tend to be, if they're part of the intelligentsia, love America. And when you say America, it's the historic America. For any Islamic scholar or Chinese scholar, America is a little young pup. We've only been around about 250 years. That's not very long. So if the last number of decades have been not so good, that's not America. In fact, the America that China is interfacing with is the America of the founder of the Schiller Institute, Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche. Who are Americans, and Helga LaRouche is known as the Silk Road lady, and
but she's German.
Yeah, she's a German patriot, and Mr. LaRouche was an American patriot. In 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrated, and we published a call for a new Silk Road. That was in 91. And the period of the 90s, Mr. LaRouche was meeting with Chinese scholars throughout the decade, talking about how can we grow China. And allow me just read one thing from one of my recent articles. This is from the head of European Studies at the China International Institute. And he talked at one of our conferences just before Xi Jinping announced the Dialog, the Belt and Road Initiative. And he was describing the discussion process with Mr. LaRouche. So this is a very well-known figure in China. He spoke in 2013. He said, "I know that relations between Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche and China, they track back about 20 years now, when a very popular Chinese journal published an article by Mr. LaRouche. In that article, Mr. LaRouche predicted that China needed to do something more at that time. Otherwise, the Chinese wealth would transfer from the mainland rural area to the coastal area and then be exported to other countries." And Mr. LaRouche reminded us Chinese that there was very bad thinking in China at that time. That is, that we need to make money as quickly as possible. LaRouche said that that would be dangerous to the moral system of China, and it would be dangerous, harmful to those people, that is the elites, who could decide what is the right direction for China to go in. So at that time, Mr. LaRouche suggested that what China needed to do was to go back to a classical national economic principle, because that is the basis of all Western big powers' success in history. He said, time is flying, and also for the Chinese people. We have always respected those people who believe that they practice life for one goal. As a Confucianist. So finally, permit me to call Mr. LaRouche a Confucian mentor. And when I'm at the UN, I'll end by saying this. I was meeting with a very prominent Russian political figure. And so we were talking about, the topic was the tremendous press censorship throughout the West, the rewriting of history. And this person looked at me and said, your American Revolution was a great gift for mankind. It changed the possibilities of the political world globally. What happened? What happened? And this person was angry with me, since I was an American in the discussion, as if I was responsible for what happened. But that indignation was appropriate. But what this person said is, this American Revolution was a gift. Implicitly, let's see you revive it. And in fact, one footnote, Schiller and his circle, von Humboldt, Herbart, were studied by German Americans intensely throughout the period of about 1800 to 1840. And it gave birth to an education movement with the National Educational Foundation, I think it was called, in the late 1800s, based on Schiller's idea that the job of a teacher is not to teach knowledge. Knowledge was not the purpose. The purpose of a good teacher, the requirement of a good teacher, is to build the character of the young person. And the educational system throughout the United States in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s was based upon this German idea from Herbart of Bildung, of developing character. And of course, what does this remind us of? Confucius. So I think there is a basis for America to wake up from its corrupt sleep.
Well, I think there is so much to bring from all this, that history, and also to bring it back today, to be able to find a proper way of having a dialogue between Europe on the one hand, the United States and China on the other hand, but also other cultures. I mean, the question of culture on the Silk Road, I know from my studies of the Islamic world, is that the greatest thing which came through the Silk Road, the ancient Silk Road, is the transfer of philosophy, science, and technology. And the most important commodity ever was not silk, was not gold, it was paper. The ability to produce paper in an industrial way. Because we had a renaissance in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Cairo, in the 8th and 9th century, but there wasn't enough material to write that knowledge on. And suddenly, with learning from the Chinese how to produce paper en masse, we had an explosion of replication of scientific discoveries, architecture, technology, hydropower, all kinds of hydraulics, and we had the Islamic Renaissance actually owes a lot to the learning how to produce paper and disseminate knowledge and philosophy and science to entire world all the way to Europe. And I think this is a very, very fascinating aspect of the Silk Road, the ancient Silk Road, but I think it also will become very important part of the Belt and Road Initiative. I thank you very much, Richard and Stephen, for giving us this joyful discussion, enriching discussion. And I'm sure we will have, our viewers will ask for more, and definitely we need to have a specific seminar or webinar specifically to discuss these cultural, scientific, aesthetical matters. So thank you very much for joining us, and looking forward to further discussions and new podcasts. Goodbye.
Great, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.